you were saying?
Yeah, some of the better literacy corpsmen obviously felt that there was no way to separate teaching people reading and writing from the larger issues of how to try to organize their village better and make some improvements in their life, because that was just part of even the teaching. I mean, you had books that would tell people how to read and write, and some of the examples in books were about people living together and how they could change things for the better, and how they could get together and cooperate to build a better bridge across a stream in the village, or things like this. And a lot of the literacy corpsmen did get into that kind of activity. And sometimes, as I say, it ran afoul of some of the traditional power bases in these villages and got them into trouble. Then the health corps was another very popular idea, because obviously the military had resources at its disposal, trucks and even in some cases airplanes and so on, to have access to remote villages. And so whenever they came to a village, they were always well received, because people had in the past, just had to rely on their own resources and folk medicine and so on for any kind of a serious problem. It might have been a day or two before they could get to a large enough town for a serious operation or something. So the idea of the health corps coming out to a village, even on a sort of a circuit basis, where they might come to some village every 2 weeks on a Tuesday or whatever, something like that. Wherever the system was, it was better than they'd had. So they really, I think, got a good image of the military from the literacy corps and health corps programs. So I think the Shah was very wise, and I was one of the people that, as we've discussed here in this one airgun I wrote later, I tried to show in some of the reporting I did in the 70s the way in which these reforms had over time borne fruit in some areas, and given the Shah a certain amount of credit with the rural people, even though he was still considered very remote and almost no factor in their daily lives, yet still land reform and the literacy corps, health corps, some of these better reforms that they thought were important to their daily lives gave him a somewhat positive image. And I think that is the kind of internal security we're really talking about in this plan, because the military did not want to be perceived as a total drain on the country. And it's, you can understand that. I mean, when you have such a large country with so many daily problems in people's lives, if the military in any way could help out with some of those, it was really seen as a tremendous change. And so I think it was a well-conceived plan in that sense, because the Iranian military over the centuries has been considered, a real scourge to everyone in the rural areas. So they had to overcome a tremendous backlog of prejudice.
According to this report by General Eckhart, who was wearing armor schmag in the mid-early 60s, he stated that armor schmag played a major role in stimulating the civic action programs organized by the Iranian government. Did the embassy work with armor schmag and civic action?
Oh, yeah.
And what was the role of the embassy, I guess?
Well, I think we simply, as I recall, we simply supported the whole concept and gave them advice on how to do it, how people should be approached, and so on. The military had its own tremendous command structure. Armor schmag was a very large operation, and they had their own ways of doing things. The coordination was really at the top level, just to make sure that everyone more or less was in agreement on how to proceed. But in an operational sense, we didn't have much input to it, as far as I recall.
Okay. According to Eckhart's report, there was an uprising by the Fars tribe in southern Iran during the early 60s that, I guess, helped stimulate the Shah's interest in counterinsurgency, civic action, and so forth. Was there much concern over this rebellion, the Fars? rebellion? Do you remember much about that?
Well, it was just one more incident of continued tribal unrest that flared up over many years because the Shah's father, Reza Shah, had brutally repressed the tribes in the course of unifying the country. And the Iranian history books are full of, or not say history books, but discussions of their past history among themselves are filled with stories of brutality that the Shah wreaked on villages when he was taking over, that is, Reza Shah. Tremendous horror stories of people being killed and maimed and betrayed. In one incident, he brought tribal people in to talk to his representatives under a ceasefire, truce arrangement, and then just put them in prison. And so there are all kinds of situations like that which had resulted in quite a bit of enmity between the tribes and the government, and there were occasional situations like that broke out where some tribe would try to be independent in some way which would be perceived as a threat to the government, and the government would send in troops and so on. But some of it was just minor brigandage too. I mean, you had situations where travelers would be attacked or something like that, and then the government would react to it because it was felt that this was a blemish on the country's record to have travelers attacked in some remote part of the country. And so there was that sort of thing that did happen on occasion. But tribal relations were always a problem for the government because they tried over a long period of time to, particularly on into the 70s, to resettle the tribes, particularly nomadic tribes who would wander across large areas with their flocks and so on. The government tried to settle people down in one area so that they would not be this sort of divisive force where they were always moving along and through large areas. If they felt if they settled them down, they could get a tribal structure that was more pliable and more amenable to government control.
I read in some of the classified CIA reports from this period that one element of sort of U.S.-Iran tensions, maybe a minor element, but was an element of tension, I guess in any case, was the litigation in U.S. courts by a former Iranian national named Khyber Khan, I guess who was a tribal leader himself. And he claimed that the Shah and his family owed him $7 million for a sports complex he was supposed to build near Tehran. And I guess he was able to attach some property owned by the Shah's brother or something like that.
This is Khyber Khan Gudarzi.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Do you remember how much trouble did this cause, this episode cause? Do you remember anything about this?
I think it was much more of a cause célèbre in our reporting than it really was in fact. Because it became such an issue, Gudarzi made all these charges in the States, and he made them in trials, and that they got a lot of publicity and so on, but I don't think it was really a major factor. It was an embarrassment to the Shah's regime, and they couldn't understand why we couldn't simply step in and quash this fellow for saying all these terrible things about the royal family. But we kept explaining that under our system people had the right to redress in the courts, and it was a very divisive thing in that period of time, an issue of very great concern to the Shah on occasion, but in the overall scheme of things it was not important.
Yeah, apparently I guess he claimed that the millions of dollars of aid money had been diverted to the Pahlavi Foundation to various American friends of the Shah, I guess Roy Anderson and so forth. That's what he claimed. But were these charges discussed? Did these charges come to the embassy's attention?
Oh yeah, sure. But Gudarzi was such an unsavory character. There were so many reports about his own lifestyle, the way he was a tremendous spendthrift and drove fancy cars. And had a tremendous wardrobe, and I mean, just one of these people who were so given to excesses that when he said things, they were obviously dressed up for the maximum impact. And I didn't really get deeply involved in the affair. Some other people worked on it more than I did, so maybe I shouldn't make any definitive judgments. But my impression was that Good RZ was pretty much of a ne'er-do-well who enjoyed the publicity of all these charges, and I don't think he ever proved any of these, way out allegations that he made. He may have been owed some money. I don't know the details of that, but most of the comments he made were just invented, I think, for press consumption.
Okay. During the years after '63, when Lyndon Johnson became president, was there any change, or in the thrust or the emphasis of American policy towards Iran? Did it pretty much continue along the same lines as it had under Kennedy? Johnson's general approach?
Well, I think there was a gradual change because, when Kennedy first came in, he made such a point of our not being willing to continue supporting autocratic regimes if they didn't start doing something to earn their spurs by helping the people. And that, as we discussed before, led to Amini being named by the Shah, so on. I think that gradually dissipated when Kennedy was assassinated and Johnson took over, because Johnson was a different type of person, and that sort of brave New World rhetoric that we had from Kennedy, no burden is too great for us to bear, and so on, go out and help the world, and so on, the Peace Corps, so many of these things that were looked upon by many people as really very inspiring. That sort of stayed as an aura of the early Kennedy period, and then when Kennedy was assassinated, it all became sort of, a previous mythology, and I think people looked upon Johnson as the man behind the scenes, the power broker who came in, and he got credit for continuing all the policies of Kennedy, but I don't think that there was the same feeling that he wanted to push dictators to do good things for their people and so on, even though he was doing a lot of great things here in the States. I mean, so many of our policies of civil rights and improvement of people's benefits and so on were undertaken by Johnson, pushed through with great success. But in terms of foreign relations, I don't think Iranians perceived him as having quite the same, if you will, altruism that Kennedy had. And then, as time went on, he became, of course, more and more involved in Vietnam and what was happening there. Vietnam was looked upon by a lot of Iranians as very negative. I remember talking to a lot of Iranians about it, and they particularly, before I left Iran, people were beginning to ask why we were doing this, and they always, of course, brought things back to their own situation, and they thought that we were doing something in Vietnam that was really disadvantageous to the people there, and they linked that to what they considered to be some of the excesses of American policies and American involvement in Iran. They saw this as similar, even though obviously it was quite a different situation, but they perceived some similarity, that close alliance with the West means you're going to be, your own cultural values and your own ways of doing things are going to be eventually sort of crushed by the weight of all this new modernism coming in to make itself felt.
In the Church Committee hearings, there was lots of letters that came to light related to Northrop Corporation and Kermit Roosevelt and so forth. And one letter I saw was from Kermit Roosevelt to an official at Northrop, General Timberlake, from April '65. In a letter, Roosevelt mentions the Shah's low opinion of Assistant Secretary of State Phillips Talbot. And the Shah says, according to Roosevelt, that Iran could stand on its own feet, so that it need not worry about incidents in Iranian-American relations caused by people like Talbot. Now, is he referring to some particular episode, perhaps? Or was he referring about Talbot's earlier involvement in the task force that was pushing for internal reform and so forth? Do you have any sense of what that was?
I'm sorry, I really don't recall.
Yeah.
But I would say, to keep this and other things in perspective, anytime the Shah saw anything in the press or in public statements that he considered to be in any way pejorative in its reference to Iran, or whether implicit or explicit, he would be upset, and he would make a point with any visitor or with his next audience with the ambassador or whatever, complain about these things bitterly. And there was also, I think, a feeling which he showed, and which most Iranians believed, that the U.S. controlled its press. And when you said, well, something came out in the press, we had no control over that, they just didn't believe it. I mean, they said, you can't tell us that your government doesn't influence and control what appears in the New York Times and in the Washington Post and Los Angeles Times and whatever other newspaper. Because, of course, in their country, that's the way things were done. If newspapers reported something that the government didn't want reported, their allocation of government-paid ads would mysteriously diminish, or they would have trouble getting their supplies of newsprint, whatever. There were ways to make the press behave, and they couldn't understand why a powerful country like the U.S. couldn't do the same thing, and they just assumed we did. So when things came out in the press, they always got upset about it.
And one thing you were sort of alluding to earlier, the question of military sales. And one issue that came up in early '66, I think before you left, was the controversy over the sale of F-4s. Now, apparently the Shah believed that the U.S. price is too high, and he threatened to buy MiGs from the Soviet Union, where you get better credit terms, apparently, and a lower price. How much of this controversy did you know about at the time?
Really very little. That was not something that I was concerned with, since I was working on internal relations. But this was, I think, a typical problem that he had. He wanted to stay with American arms because he felt our arms were of good quality, and he knew that we had a very effective policy of support for those arms. That is, he could get spare parts, he could depend on military advisors supplied by the U.S. to stick to their business and tell people how to run the equipment but not get into political activities. All this was, I think, a plus on his side, in his view, but he also complained bitterly about the cost. And it got more and more sensitive from this period on into the 70s, because I remember many discussions that I'd seen in writing where he would have some particular part from a plane, and he just said, you know what this cost in 1972, and you know what it cost now in 1976 or whatever, and he would cite the astronomical increases in costs of various parts, and demand that we provide them at a reasonable cost, or else he would have to just go and buy Soviet equipment because he just couldn't afford these prices. So this was a consistent policy from mid-60s on into the 70s, that yes, I'll buy your equipment because I think it's good quality and well supported, but I've just got to have better terms, one way or the other.
Okay.
And then eventually the demand, another demand that came in with that was, I'm not only going to be a customer, but I want some things produced in Iran. and that brought in the whole co-production idea, which
Right.
has been with us for decades, but I mean not just with Iran, but Pakistan and many other countries have demanded that they get a chance to co-produce certain items that are maybe made with, to American specifications, but some of the work's going to be done in the country so that they share in some of the benefit of being able to produce those items in their country, or components in their country.
I think 66, you were saying to IRNR back on intelligence research
Right.
division back at the State Department.
Right.
How did that come about? How was it that you were assigned to that office?
Well, it's a complicated procedure to find an assignment, and it was considered not unusual for someone who'd been in a particular country to come back and work in INR, because they wanted people who had experience in the country to analyze developments, and it gave you a certain freedom to spend a lot of time researching certain issues that you may have had almost no time to do when you're in the midst of a busy embassy, because everything on whatever country you're working on, or whatever several countries you're working on, comes to a number of people in the building, but comes to the INR analyst, who's the one person perhaps in the whole building who's able to spend full time on that one country. In every aspect. You've got the desk that of course is working on Iranian affairs. Maybe they have 2 or 3 people, but they're doing the entire range of things, planning visits, receiving visitors from the country, down to such details as writing toasts and speeches, and taking care of any issue that comes up about the country raised by anyone in the United States, answering letters. People come in with problems which they want the desk to resolve. There's so many everyday activities on the country desk that people there really have fairly little time to sit down and really analyze what's going on in the country. The country director system was designed to overcome that, to have one person at a fairly senior level who could devote the time, because he had a staff to do the sort of daily work. He could devote the time to think ahead about issues with the country, and that worked to some extent. But he kept getting tied up too into actual problems of how are we going to get the lower interest rate for these F4 purchases, or how are we going to satisfy the Shah's latest demand for this or that. And the INR person then really has the luxury of time to look at everything that's coming across his or her desk and make some conclusions, perhaps be a little innovative in how he or she views what's happening, and write papers which may or may not be totally the party line, and may perhaps try to give some new thought or new concern, new interpretation into facts everyone has seen. So I think it's a very useful purpose, and I had good relations with the desk. I went to their meetings, frequent meetings, to sort of hear about operational things that were going on. But I also had the freedom to write my own views on things to some extent. You had to obviously ground it very much in facts, but if you could show maybe a slightly different interpretation of the facts than the desk was getting, I think it gave people a little more perspective on the country, because you could see 2 somewhat different views. And of course INR was sensitive to the problem of not wanting to be always the voice of gloom and doom, or predicting revolution or catastrophe just in order to someday be right. I think we've produced pretty balanced material in general, and I think the study on political dynamics, for example, holds up pretty well when you look at it in view of later events.
Now, who else in INR was working on Iran?
I was the only one.
Oh, the only one? Okay.
There was more or less a regional person under whom I served.
What was that?
Phil Stoddard, when I first came back, and then later Iran was moved under South Asia affairs under Tom Thornton. But in both cases, oh, stop it. Sorry about the dog making noise. In both cases, these were people who were very good analysts and well experienced in problems of the general area. And I felt very comfortable in discussing everything with them and, sending my drafts through them. I felt no pressure to take any particular point of view. I was free to analyze events as I saw them, and of course there was an editorial process. Not everything I would write in my first draft would get through to the top, but at least I felt it was a good constructive relationship.
Okay, now at this time, 66, 67, who were the influentials in Washington when it came to policy towards Iran? Who were the various officials that you worked with?
Well, the country director was Ted Elliott.
Yeah, that's right.
And we had very good relations because I had, of course, been in the embassy in the political section when he was in the economic section. And when he came back and became country director, as I say, I was invited to meetings and so on. We often disagreed on things, and openly in meetings and so on. But on a personal basis, we got along very well. And that was sort of in the breaking in period of the country director system, because before that we had an area office system, and the thought was to have all the policy issues really centered in one person who would have a much more effective way to argue policy issues, because he or she would be aware of all aspects of one country's affairs. So we had a country director for Turkey, a country director for Iran, etc. So it was a new system, and so it had to prove itself. But I think it proved itself in the sense that issues were debated by someone who saw all aspects of the problem. I did feel on occasion that this was, to some extent, part of that same chain that I mentioned, where the Shah told the ambassador what his demands were that week, and the ambassador referred him back to Washington, and to some extent the country director was judged in his effectiveness as to how many of these things he could get done. And there was an efficient country director who could take all these demands and push them all through in one way or the other and get all the things that the Shah wanted. I thought that was a little too automatic, but that was the way the system worked at that time.
Who at other agencies are working on Iran that you would meet with? Like people at AID or Defense, or do you recall any names?
Well, we'd have a weekly country team meeting, and there would be typically a dozen or 15 people there.
Once a week?
Yeah, representing all different agencies. AID, Defense, Treasury, Agriculture. I mean, it was really a major operation. Commerce. Whatever issue came up, there would be 2 or 3 people at least who would have different views on it, or have something to contribute. So it was quite a good discussion group. And Ted Elliott would typically run down a whole series of issues that were hot that particular week, and sort of tell people what was happening, and get coordination in case some people weren't totally aware of some part of it or how it might affect their agency. They would then hear about it at that meeting, and they could go back and tell their people. It was quite a good coordinating mechanism. I think worked very smoothly.
Do any names stand out among people who were involved in those meetings? That
No.
Yeah.
No, really don't.
Yeah. Now, how closely did the analysts at INR, yourself included, of course, work with their counterparts at the various military intelligence agencies or CIA? Was there much exchange of information with them?
Well, there was some. It was not institutionalized, but there was some. Yes, you occasionally would call up somebody and ask them about something that you had seen that they'd written. But everyone had their own special focus. If there was a discussion of some new weapon that the Shah was getting, usually DIA would do quite an analysis of that. In one of their publications, you'd have a picture of the weapon, and you'd have an assessment of how they could use it, and so on. So that was their specialized function. So I think we had, in state, less contact with DIA than we did with CIA, because their role was very limited. CIA would be more into a lot of different issues. They later on began to develop, and it was only in the 70s, to develop excellent publications on energy matters, oil, natural gas, etc. But at that time, we would interact on a lot of political and economic issues. But I wouldn't say it was a frequent occasion.
What did you think about the CIA did analyses from time to time of the internal situation in Iran?
We got all those.
What did you think about them in terms of their quality? Like during the 60s, I guess. Were they useful, or were they well done?
Well, they're all useful because it was an act of faith in INR that everything is grist for the mill. You never shut off any source of knowledge, even if it was highly prejudiced or whatever. That was the one place in the whole building where everything could be moved across your desk and looked at and analyzed. And so I think that was, within that basic premise, I think the CIA reporting was very good. We always looked carefully at the source, because most of the reports were pretty much raw intelligence. Mr. So-and-so gave the following analysis of this subject, and then it would describe him just in very basic terms. A businessman trained in France, whose reporting has generally been accurate in the past. Just something like that. So you tried to analyze the source carefully to see whether the material he was giving you in this report fit in or not. And some of the stuff was very, very good. Then some stuff was sent in because it had just been sucked up in this giant intelligence gathering machine, and it wasn't considered by the people collecting it to be worthless, but it may have been, for example, less reliable. And sometimes you got a flavor of that this source has occasionally provided reliable material or useful information or something. Then you got the impression, well, maybe they didn't think much of him as a source, and you'd read it and you'd see why, because sometimes these guys were reporting grandiose stories and rumors about what was happening, which are just loosely based on fact. So sometimes you had to be really selective as to how you use the material, because it might be really off the wall. And particularly, I would say stuff that they got from some of the Savak people was often highly exaggerated. Just sort of coffee house rumors that they picked up here and there, and it was just sucked up by Savak, and then in turn passed by Savak on to the agency, and some of that was pretty worthless.
Yeah. Which brings me to another question that's come up since the revolution. One issue that has come up is that there's a degree to which U.S. intelligence agencies became dependent upon the Savak for their sources of internal information as to the opposition to the Shah and so forth. I guess Alan Goodman has made that argument. It's an article he wrote, that the U.S. became too dependent upon the Savak for information as to what's going on internally in Iran. To what extent was that becoming actually true in the 60s or the following years? You mentioned one instance of that where it was passed on, but were they really reliant upon Savak information as the decade progressed? Or?
I don't think so. I think that's unfair, because as few people in the embassy in our political section as came back to Iran, and it was very few people, there were a number of instances in the other political section where people came back to Iran after being there years earlier and provided the kind of continuity. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oops.
Provided a kind of continuity and also since they knew where to go for information from their previous experience, they could go back and follow up with some of the same people. They could see when things were being exaggerated. I think they still relied a great deal on a lot of sources. I think that's an unfair criticism. I mean, sure, Savak passed on information, but I think everybody in the agency was well aware of the weaknesses of Savak. So I don't think that we became overly dependent on their analyses of things. I mean, I can speak fairly authoritatively on that because I knew some of the people there from previous tours or got to know them quite well there in my first or second tour, and I think they were quite objective in judging information that was passed on to us by Savak.
Okay. Now you mentioned earlier the paper you wrote on the political dynamics of Iran, and Bill Noah's role in writing that. And who's the other person you mentioned?
Larry Samad.
Larry Samad. You mentioned the embassy was pretty critical of the paper, and the argument that the U.S. sort of distanced itself from the Shah somewhat more than it had in the past. What was the role of people like that? What was the response of people like Elliott and others at the State Department? How they evaluate your paper or your arguments?
Well, I think you'd have to ask them to really know what.
Well, did you get feedback? I mean, did you get feedback? Responses, written responses to.
Not from the desk, no.
He mentioned it in an interview. He mentioned it was an important critical paper, but he didn't really go into it.
I think there was probably a sense in some circles, and that would include the country directorate for Iran, that INR was sort of the duty Cassandra. INR was the place where officers would be able to write down critical analyses of things that were happening in various countries, sort of to balance, if you will, the more upbeat kind of writing you get from the country desk, and that this was just sort of our role, and if you cried wolf long enough, then at some point, it might be true. So I think there was some feeling that we purposely indicated that the Shah had some weaknesses, and that the country was not as shining an example of democracy as some people would have it, and that this was just sort of intrinsic in the role, and that I had fallen into this role of writing a lot of negative things about Iran. It was just two different views, and I don't think it gave Ted any particular problems. Whereas it did give the ambassador problems, because he felt that this whole paper had come out and was really quite negative about the Shah's power, and questioned whether we should be as close in our support of the Shah as we were.
But there was no similar feedback from higher ups in the State Department, say Assistant Secretary level or.
No, they're just too busy. I mean, people in higher levels probably never even read that report. Because at any given moment there are hundreds of pages of material coming into the department from the embassy, and with all different kinds of problems being analyzed. Some of them just spur of the moment issues, some deeper analytical pieces, but people just don't have enough time for that. There's a whole wide world out there with lots and lots of problems, and unless they're really serious, they tend to get just into the outbox and put into the file.
Well, for someone like Meyer, for example, why he was rather critical, apparently, of the paper, or the people he worked. Was it Meyer directly, or is it the political counselor who was speaking for Meyer? Do you recall the circumstances?
Yes, Meyer wrote a letter directly to the head of INR, complaining about that. Now, wait now. Let me back up.
Yeah.
I know he wrote a letter complaining about my prediction that the Shah would buy Soviet arms no matter what terms we gave him.
Yeah.
The other, well, there was feedback from the embassy on the political dynamics report, and that I think that may have been institutionally unclear as to just who, and it may have been shared by Hertz and Meyer, I don't know, but the other one I think got a direct reply from Meyer saying that this prediction that the Shah would go to the Soviets was unhelpful to the embassy's efforts to try and get the best terms that it could for the Shah, to keep him buying American.
Yeah.
Which I felt was, unfair criticism because this was an internal document. It wasn't published. It was an internal document for U.S. government use. So there was no way that this was going to get to the Iranian.
Yeah. But in terms of the political dynamics report, the question was that you were criticizing, in a sense, the linchpin theory.
Yeah.
And that was what that led to the negative response.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think people like Meyer, was not an idiosyncratic point of view. This is in terms of the linchpin theory. What made people like Meyer what made them so committed to that approach? I mean, I think Meyer was speaking. People like Russ probably held the same position, I suppose, in practice. What made people like that so committed to this idea of a linchpin? Why was the Shah so important?
Well, I think it came down to sort of a bottom line analysis that after all is said and done, the Shah is still the man in charge there, and he has his faults, but he's trying to do some good things. He has some ideas for how to develop his country, and so we might as well go with him because there's no alternative. I think that's the way it came down.
Yeah.
And if you argued the issue, probably they would end up saying, well, it's nice to have these concerns about our long-range policy toward him and so on, but for now, he's all we have, so let's go with it and go on to the next problem.
And they saw him as essential for stability in the region, like in terms of oil and security and so forth. That was all the various considerations of interest that they talked about all the time.
Even though in the 70s, that argument rang pretty hollow because here the Shah was leading the fray of all the producing countries who wanted more and more for each barrel of oil. So we were confronted with this odd situation where the man that we had backed because he provided stability and a guaranteed source of oil and so on, all these good things, he was leading the opposition to get more and more from us for every barrel of oil, and the only way that we still were getting what we wanted was that he was turning around and using that oil money to buy billions of dollars worth of military equipment from the United States. So that's how the petrodollars are being recycled in the Shah's case, and turn right around and award big contracts to obtain items from the United States.
Now, in your political dynamics paper, you mentioned that you suggest that Iran, in some way, is basically politically unhealthy, and I guess liable to future episodes, and possibly subject to future episodes of political instability and problems. Did you believe that would be the case as long as Iran was ruled on the basis of sort of royal absolutism? You see it as a sort of a basic problem, or was it more something else?
Yes, that was my conclusion. Basically, because the Shah could not allow any institution to grow up that had any independence whatsoever, because everything had to be kept at a low enough level that he could run things and not be threatened. And any institution that became somewhat independent was a threat to him personally, and therefore had to be undercut. So I don't. Any organization, whether you take the central bank or the land reform ministry or NIOC, or whatever, all these institutions had to be kept at a level where they could have some independence of view on occasion, but still, when the chips were down, they would always do what the Shah wanted. And so there could be really no institutional development under that kind of rule, because the Shah controlled everything down to such a level. And he personally passed on, according to what I've been told, personally passed on the assignments of every military officer from captain on up. Wherever they were going to go in the country, he had to personally approve all this list of transfers of officers.